Thank you very much, NJ. If I can ask you to stay on the stage, do you mind grabbing a chair? Brian, Polina, Max, if you can join us as well. And what we'd like to do for the next 15 minutes is indeed ask the panel as a group a series of questions that indeed you might all be itching to ask that will hopefully give you a more perspective rather than from a singular perspective, a more unified perspective of views of what could be developed indeed as a new sensing technology. I guess maybe to just get us going, the one thing that was very striking about the talks is, in my head, is we had mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, material scientists, and engineers present us different ways to do biological, chemical, mechanical sensing, and how to build systems actually to go with that. But in each case, the one thing that I guess strikes me is that we're using an entirely new material set. Is it PDMS, or is it flexible fibers? Is it new sensors that can be 2D integrated? Ways to laminate nanoscale thick membranes? There hasn't been, call it, too many technologies that started using new materials and got launched the next year. So maybe as going maybe down from JJ, how soon do you think technology you have just now showed us will indeed be available at a store near you?
Great question. So indeed, as you said, if you have used new materials, that's usually longer learning curve, right? But I want to emphasize that despite we use new materials, a lot of process we're using here, we can directly leverage existing infrastructure, like silicon microfabrication facilities. So for example, for some of our on-chip spectrometer work we are actually doing, we actually fabricated not in-house. We were actually able to outsource the fabrication to some commercial foundries. And this immediately enables us to actually kind of perform technology transition if we wish. So we do expect that some of technologies can get commercialized in very short time frame, like a couple of years.
Polina?
So the question for our work generally comes more from an approval perspective rather than a materials perspective. A lot of the, so as everyone knows that Federal Drug Regulation Agency, FDA, does not approve materials, it approves devices, the whole assemblies. So even though each of our materials has been known to be biocompatible and benign and we test for that, then every single device that we create has to go through rigorous approval because all of them are implantable somehow into the body. In terms of our fiber work, we're looking at applications first in the scientific community to elucidate the workings of the nervous system, but also looking into more of a desperate case scenario, such as in case of spinal cord injury, where there's really no other options, and as a result, there's a lot more routes for evaluation and sort of moving towards patients, but of course it still has to go through appropriate channels. In case of our magnetism work, the particles that we synthesize are actually quite similar, chemically identical, in fact, to particles that are currently being used as MRI contrast agents. So, but with somewhat more improved crystal structures, so the properties are superior. So from that regard, we actually get quite a bit of interest from physicians because they believe that that would be a relatively straightforward transition because it's already being used in a phase 3 clinical trial for cancer. And in our case, we will be doing it for neuromodulation. But again, approval is something that is a concern.
Yeah. Next.
Yeah, so I think a very simple, almost naive answer would be there's a saying that from lab to fab takes about 10, 15 years. Now the reason why I think that's a naive answer is because it really oversimplifies everything. And actually, to give a more detailed answer, I think it's important to reference something I was actually saying in the keynote today, which is that the technologies, what we end up doing with them is highly dependent on the application space. I mean, there's the example of a HDTV from a company where new technology was around and nothing happened with it, right? And I think similarly, when you look at the technologies we're talking about, if we wanted to make a billion transistor chip using carbon nanotubes as an example, all perfect, right? Maybe that would take 10 years, right? But are there application spaces that we can build things that work today, that actually work and give us real benefits? Sure. And I think the importance of being able to exploit these auxiliary applications is not only do they themselves give us a lot of value, there's a huge proposition value there, but it's really an on-ramp to what we also want to do further down the road. So it's really a double win. So I think when answering the question in terms of how far out is technology, we really have to be smart about answering what do we want to use that technology for now, and then in 5 years, and 10 years, and 15 years, you really need that entire roadmap.
Who's wearing contact lenses today? Any artificial fingernails? Not as many. So we don't have to do the market penetration for contact lenses. So I agree that certainly some new material systems are required, but I think one of the interesting things that we're seeing is learning how to do engineered precision systems with materials that do exist. So PDMS that you find in soft contact lenses, that sort of, that's a known material. PMMA, what you would find in the acrylic of your artificial nails. So I think many of the applications, certainly the applications that we're looking at, would benefit from just sort of being able to do more precise engineered systems with the materials that are already accepted, which I think will accelerate the rate with which some of these things can be translated.
Excellent. Well, that was a general question for all of the panelists, but maybe you have specific questions for one or two of them. Any questions? Yes, great.
I guess, Max, this one's probably directed at you, but I think it's relevant to all of this to discuss. When you talk about the different material systems, you had a CMOS layer, you had a carbon nanotube layer, you had gaskets in there. How are you working the CAD design interfaces across those different processes?
Do you mind repeating the question?
Yeah. So, and correct me if I'm wrong. So the question was, we're integrating all these different materials, all these different technologies. How do we design a system like that, right? Let alone build it, right, in the fab. But how do you actually design a chip, right? Design a system. Sorry.
And simulate.
And simulate. Exactly. Good question. So I'll speak very briefly about our specific instance, and then I'll kind of blow it out to a more general case, and then anyone else can answer too. So in our specific case, again, we really took a step back and had to answer, how do we make something feasible? And it's important to recognize that, yes, there's a lot of money and man and women hours that have been invested in the fabrication infrastructure, right? But there's an equal amount, if not more so, amount of time and money that's been invested in the design infrastructure. So actually, everything that we do not only uses the same fabrication techniques, the same fabrication facilities as regular silicon, we also use the exact same tools, the exact same design infrastructure that already exists, specifically for that purpose. There's a lot of things we could do to make it easier if we didn't follow that, but make sure we do, because in order to be practical, it needs to. Now to kind of expand out a little bit, I don't think that necessarily has to be a constraining fact, right? I think, when you look at, for instance, my group, and our collaborators, we just don't focus on how to build things, right? We have collaborators who are, CS, for instance, who work on how do you code up a system like this. We work with more architects who do look at how do we re-optimize the design of a system, right? So these are more opportunities to be had that we can exploit new designs, but it's also important that a lot of what we do is also compatible, backwards compatible with what exists today.
Yes.
So if I can, let me just actually, okay.
Question for Max as well on the fully integrated 3D. On the logic side, how much complexity can you do?
It's a great question. Very complex. So I don't mean flippant. To give you the background, I started working on some of these new technologies, myself and my own PhD even as an undergrad a decade ago. I'm older than I look. And back then, I gotta say, when we talk about new technologies, on one hand, it's very exciting because we used to talk about all the amazing things we could enable. On the other side, it's super depressing because we would talk about making these complex systems, and in the lab, we'd make a single transistor, right? So there's such a big disconnect between what we use to motivate our work and what we were actually doing in the lab. So really, this is what our focus is. It's bridging this gap. It's trying to actually, for the first time, build really complex, large systems using new materials and technologies. And that's what we can do. As I mentioned, that system that I talked about had 2 million FETs. When you get to that level of wafer scale integration, you are talking about VLSI fabrication and design already. You can't pick and choose components. It really is wafer scale. Of course, there's more work to be done, right? There's a lot of work that still is left to be done on the ground level. But I think in terms of the progress that we've made, there's an enormous amount. And on top of that, we've finally hit this threshold. I think this is the most important part. We finally hit this threshold where for the first time, we can actually do real applications, which you cannot do with hardware today. And being able to hit that threshold is so important because it enables us to really get out of the lab and start working and forming collaborations, with industry partners, with people who work in hospitals for real applications. Right? So it really enables us to really grow the work so much faster now.
Just wanted to add a comment on the first question. So I think one of the other interesting things about sort of the design tools is that is recognized as a sort of significant need. And if you look at AIM photonics and you look at the flexible electronics and in fiber, there is a significant federal investment to look at how do we take the design infrastructure that does exist and embed these other capabilities that are necessary that don't currently exist. So there is a significant federally funded activity to really amplify the design capabilities of what currently exists. And there's certainly research that's required to take it to the next level. But it's an area that's getting there's a significant funding opportunity and significant interest from industry, both the suppliers of the design tools and the users of the design tools.
And I guess on top of that, also to train the workforce to utilize the tool sets and the new tool sets we need to be able to develop based on these new technologies. Other questions? Yes.
I have a question for Polina. Thanks. I have a question for you regarding magnetogenetics. So when you heat these particles, how far does the effect extend over just the cell on which the particle is attached, or over several cell lengths? First of all, and second of all, how do you plan to activate, say, different types of cells all located in the same region of space? Are there ways to orthogonally activate different types of nanoparticles?
So those are two questions. And one is the how far does the heat propagate from a particle, as I understand it correctly? And the other one, is there a possibility to orthogonally activate multiple cells that are collocated? So the first question is actually a really challenging question because the problem of nanoscale heat transfer is not been solved. People have worked on it in the case of, let's say, on-chip devices that are all solid state, but we are working with a transition from solid state to a soft polymer, which we use as a coating for our particles. And in this case, the theory developed for nanoscale heat transport for solid state systems actually does not work. So we get results that are not representative of experimental data. So theory would say that you should have temperature increase of 10 to minus 7 Kelvin next to the particle. And it's obviously wrong because we know that we can have tens of degrees of heating in the particle surface, which propagates about 2 nanometers to maybe 5 nanometers maximum. So far, our experiments have been really boring, where we had relatively large droplets of particles essentially bathing a large group of neurons together. So it was all bulk heating. But we have done some experiments where we're essentially coating the cell surface with particles, and then you have a planar heat transport rather than, again, a nanoscale transport. But it's, again, this is a fundamental question that we are working on. Your other question, we have actually solved, and it is possible to do magnetic multiplexing, where you, and what you're taking advantage of is actually quite simple. The effect that we use is hysteresis to get heating in particles, and that depends on the size of the hysteresis loop, which depends on the property of a particle called magnetic anisotropy, and we can really describe it with an analogy of friction. So you can imagine two surfaces that you're trying to heat up by friction, and you have a smooth surface. So in order to heat that up, you need to kind of go really quickly, but with really short strokes, and that would be an analog for that will be a magnetic field of high frequency and low amplitude. If you have a really rough surface, you would have to go with long strokes, but of relatively low frequency because it gets you nowhere. And that would be analog for lower frequency and higher amplitude of magnetic field. So, and the surfaces would represent a particle with low coercivity and high coercivity. And there is no crosstalk because a low field does not access the coercivity of a more anisotropic particle. And you can basically scale up those modalities to maybe up to, let's say, a dozen, but it depends on your synthetic prowess of how how precisely you control the size of the particle and the composition of the particle and its crystal structure. But yeah, it's a solved problem.
Yes.
Thank you. Everything you're doing is very, very exciting. And in the first presentation, we heard about the importance of application. And I guess my general question is a little bit along those lines, which is, you know, the key to this is how do you validate all your potentials? So what thoughts do you have on trying to establish what people really want?
So just in general. So I think that's certainly one of the, I think, powerful reasons that we can't sit here as academics and answer that we really need to be sitting here with our industry colleagues that have a pulse on the market and needs to find those things together. We can certainly, there are definitely cases where that new markets have been identified in the ivory tower and spun out to very successful endeavors, but I think the people and the organizations that have a better pulse on what is needed are the people that are trying to deliver those products. And so for me, that's one of the reasons that I love doing applied work and sort of having those strong connections with an industry mindset that help define those things that are needed 5, 10 years from now. But that's sort of coming from an applied research perspective.
Yeah, so I completely agree with that. And I think in addition to building a strong industrial collaboration, there are also a lot of entrepreneurial channels you can actually leverage at MIT that actually helps you to identify what niche market your product can actually enter. And in that sense, actually, I think sensing presents a unique opportunity because all the market is pretty fragmented. And then if you find a niche application, usually you can actually enter with much less competition barrier. So that's, I think, a good side here. But again, for that, you need to learn and actively collect information. Okay.
All right. I'll conclude by simply saying that nanotechnology is entering its renaissance. For all our talk of working on nanotech back in the 1990s, we were really just poking atoms, single one at a time, because we were happy that for the first time we could see them back in the mid-80s through the STM. And really in the early 2000s and now, we are finally discovering ways to truly utilize it. I mean, it does take a decade to take a new material and launch it. There are stepping stones we can imagine in a way, sacrificing some of the yield, but providing functionality that never existed before. Hopefully through these 4 talks, you got the chance to see the glimpse of what might be. And indeed, we are very much looking for your input to tell us what additional venues these types of technologies can indeed be utilized in. We have now a 10-15-minute break. We're going to call you back in. Please do step outside, relax, stretch, and we'll continue with session number 2. Thank you.